back. My name is Matthew. Thank you for joining. Continuing on here with the look at military expenditure across a variety of nations across the world, selected mostly major nations in the world today. We left off in the last video with the point that indeed it's not all about military expenditure. There are other things happening here always when you're going to fight a war. But clearly, if you're going to make certain distinctions about how a society is, how free a society is versus how enslaved a society is versus illegal occupations and aggression, like Mr. Mearsheimer tried to do, you sure as well better try and be consistent. So I addressed that in the last video. Nonetheless, we're going to step back here to looking at another metric, not just what this military expenditure represents in dollar terms, of course, which is the most common way to look at it, but also look at it now as a percentage of GDP. So again, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, wonderful research for this data. Now I'm showing here on the charts just the 2023 spend. Okay, I'm not showing 10-year, 20-year totals. So unlike the $14 trillion totals for the United States military over the last 10, 20 years, just the 2023 spend, almost $1 trillion, according to the Stockholm Peace Research Institute. China, second, about 300 billion. And then we have NATO, Western European total, 200 billion. And then Russia is in fourth place here at $100 billion. Okay. NATO Eastern Europe is about 92 billion. But again, that includes two very, in my view, perhaps tenuous countries that aren't necessarily used to dealing with the Eastern Front of what happens in Eastern Europe. That is, again, Turkey and Greece. So 7 plus 15 for Turkey, about 22, 23 billion dollars. That I'm including in the NATO Eastern Europe, just because it's it's on the Eastern Front. Turkey and Greece themselves have been adversaries a long time, even though they're both in NATO by design. It's no question that with everything that's happening in Ukraine, it's very dicey for Eastern European nations, and we can just continue to elaborate on that. Let's just go down the list here. After Greece, okay, we have Finland there on the Eastern Front, Romania, Czech Republic, Hungary, Portugal's included in the Western European. Egypt we have for other comparisons with Israel, Slovakia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Croatia. You can just see here, look, down the line, the Balts, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania here, just looking at a couple $2 billion a year in military expenditure. Okay, so if a belligerent, tyrannical mafia state such as Russia on the border of NATO Eastern European countries decides to invade, it's going to be very difficult for these countries on their own to resist. And indeed, that happened 3 times in the case of the Baltics in the 20th century. Twice by the Soviets, once by the Nazis. They were invaded, as well as Poland, of course, and Romania as well. They have dealt with that threat as well. This is just the total spend for 2023. And again, look at Ukraine, pretty close to the top of the list here of major nations. We have $65 billion in 2023. This is on top of $40 billion in 2022, and all the major spending after, of course, the major full-scale invasion that tyrannical Putin did in February 2022, which was already on the back of 8 years of occupation of the country, illegally occupying their territory. So now that we have, again, a look just at the 2023 spend, let's look at the average for the percent of GDP that military expenditure has always represented over the last 20 years. Again, so not just looking at the most recent periods, let's just look at the average and see what we can interpret from that data. Okay, so I'm going to put that, it's kind of on the right axis now in light green. Just to show you, the scale is going up to 10%. Okay, so GDP, gross domestic product, roughly, this is just all the new goods and services that an economy produces in one calendar year. It's not the best metric in economics, but often as economists, real world economists say it's the best that we have. So just as a percentage of GDP, you can see that just roughly scanning the data here, something around 2% is on average. And indeed, that's the NATO target for the military spend. Okay. But we can see a few outliers already. First of all, what's one here that's huge? Saudi Arabia, just a bit bigger than Ukraine and Germany and even the UK at the moment. Spend for 2023, you see the UK was 74 billion, Saudi Arabia close to $76 billion. That's 8.5% of their GDP. All right, so they take their defense extremely seriously. Not a liberal democracy, typically allied with the Western world, not a liberal democracy. Close to 10% of the GDP. And in fact, if you look over the last 20 years, the highest percentage of GDP on average, military spend from a rich country. Next, look at the next max country, Ukraine. Again, unbelievable because the majority of this spending happened in the last 2 years. Of course, they did increase their spending in the last 10 years when parts of their territory was illegally occupied by Russia. Again, Ukraine never invaded anyone since the history of the Soviet Union, not so in the case of Russia. All of their attacks have already gone through, cyber attacks against Estonia, continuous sort of hybrid warfare, meddling in elections attacks, it's continuing. And people like to say that it's not a big deal, or you don't want to really think about it, or you have more faith in Americans. For example, let's use the Americans. I do have faith in Americans, but it doesn't mean that it's something that shouldn't be taken seriously. So, follow Ryan Macbeth, who we've had on, look at the actual work that's being done to recognize disinformation and hybrid warfare on all levels. It's certainly happening from Russia. And as a percentage of GDP, actually, they're not the next up. The next up would be Israel. Okay, so 5.6% of GDP. That's a 20-year spend average. Huge from Israel, and obviously, due to their region of the world, not surprising. I want to go to Russia now. Of course, Russia's the next up, 4% on average over the last 20 years. That would be lower, kind of like Ukraine. That would even be lower because Russia is a massively, massively corrupt country. And by the way, I'm not comparing their corruption to Ukrainian corruption. Russia is a massively corrupt country. It is indeed a petrol station disguised as a state, a mafia state. As I've said, 1 in 5 Russians don't have a toilet. The people live as slaves. So when they say that this military spending has occurred, yes, it is a higher level than typical, but most of that increase is in the last 2 years of their full-scale war. So that's something to keep in mind. But again, at $100 billion, if you just stack them up over the full spending of major nations in 2023, they're fourth on the list, and that includes Western European NATO countries being ahead of them. Okay, so as a standalone nation, they're third. Very important to understand these things. This is the 20-year picture. The other one I wanted to say, of course, on the 20-year picture was Iran. Okay, well smaller than Israel. Both as a percentage of GDP, 2.5%. And then remember, $27 billion spent in 2023 on their military. And we know that that's going to be higher in light of the events of October 7th, 2023 for 2024. The other one I want to say here is Greece. Okay, Greece has always spent close to 3% of the GDP, which is interesting. Greece being just a legendary historical nation in many ways, that plot of land and islands that they have on the Mediterranean has always been literally open waters for foes. Greece spends. Even though you might think of Greece as just a vacationing, easygoing place, they do spend on their defense, at least for themselves. And again, one more thing just to say about this 2% number from NATO. It's not like, as Trump and many people have erroneously claimed, there's not like you're paying this 2% as your NATO dues or something. You're not paying into a NATO bank account. This is just the recommended spend, 2% of GDP for your country on your own military. And of course, when you collectivize that, when you add them all up, that is termed collective defense. And it is important, especially for Eastern European NATO countries. But it's not like this 2% is some sort of you're paying into NATO dues or a NATO bank account. This is on your own defense. That's what the guideline of 2% GDP is. Anyway, having said all that, we've looked at the long term. We've also looked at the short term in the black of the actual spend for 2023. Now let's look at the 2023 spend as a percentage of GDP. Okay. Long term, 2023. Obviously, the main outlier here again is Ukraine. All right. Ukraine, though they have received plenty of donations and support from Western countries. And again, I plead with you Americans who claim that we just send blank checks to Ukraine. No, that's not how it works. Any new spending bills that are passed in the United States are spent on American companies, on new American kit. Ukraine is given old American kit. That's how it works by and large. NATO is not on the ground in Ukraine. We certainly could, again, just looking at the United States and looking at the NATO figures in total, if we take, that is Western Europe plus Eastern Europe, you're getting to something like $300 billion more than China on a collective military spend. Plus you have the United States and NATO, plus Canada. NATO militarily could handle Russia in a matter of weeks. I'm not saying to do that. I'm just saying a matter of weeks, okay? But because of the nuclear deterrent, because Russia rattles the nuclear saber all the time, like a bully, NATO does not get involved and did not help Ukraine. So look, Ukraine at the moment, this is why they're talking about peace deals. This is why they're talking about their own nuclear deterrence or NATO, because they are going at this alone. All right, as Sergei Plokhy has said, highly recommend reading his books. This really is independence for Ukraine. This is their 1776 moment. It's been going on since November of 2013. All right, from the start of Maidan, when Yanukovych turned them away to Europe, back to Putin. All right, you need to give them agency when we talk about what Ukraine has been doing, and we should support them. Okay, the Spanish, the French supported the Americans in the American Revolution against Britain. As I've said many times, more French kit, soldiers, ships, artillery was supplied and used, and soldiers died in the final battles of the American Revolution than American. All right, so it's more American than anything to get help from your allies in revolution. There's nothing contradictory, nothing anti-American in helping allies who want their freedom, who want to preserve their freedom. I know that I often sound like a broken record when I mention these things, but people have a hard time understanding, I think, in a modern world where most of your rage is spent on something like Twitter, you're not actually experiencing the glide bombs being dropped like the Ukrainians are. NATO could, in a matter of weeks, and should have, in my view, a matter of weeks, cleared out what Russia was doing all the way back in 2014. That didn't happen. Putin was appeased. Putin continues on. This is going to continue, and Ukraine, as you can see, 36% of their GDP now they've spent on the military. It's a highly militarized economy. And by the way, Russia's continuing on that in their own way, as corrupt and terrible and basket case of a country that is. Their spend of 2023 on the GDP, 5.9%. Hope you're finding these videos creative and to the point when it comes to navigating the rough waters of the financial system. And I'm happy to share with you a platform that can do the same when it comes to getting a loan secured by your Bitcoin, and that is Debify. Debify is a non-custodial, Bitcoin-backed lending platform designed for people who want to borrow against their Bitcoin while maintaining full control. Debify offers institutional-grade liquidity through independent lenders, allowing for high-volume loans of up to 5 years. All transactions are secured by a unique multi-sig escrow system, ensuring that Bitcoin collateral remains safe and transparent. This setup guarantees that your Bitcoin is not rehypothecated, and you keep full visibility and control throughout the loan process. It's perfect for those who value security and transparency while exploring global stablecoin and fiat lending backed by Bitcoin. So head on over to debify.com today to get started. I think from that stance, again, that's the only thing I really wanted to say here. You can see Israel, typically nothing has changed, okay? It's 2023 spend, interestingly, a little bit less than the 20-year average, not much less, still well above most NATO countries, both in Western and Eastern Europe. But I will show again the Eastern European countries, such as the Baltics, such as Poland. Actually, let's even back out. Poland's a pretty big country at the current time, even though in the past they have suffered without too much ally help. Let's take off the dollar spend and the 20-year spend. Here we see Poland really increasing, okay? 3.8% of GDP, massive, well above Greek levels even. Finland high, 2.4%. Hungary around 2%. The Balts, 2.7, 2.9, 2.3%. These are the countries in Eastern Europe that are worried about further Russian belligerence. And there's no end in sight based on everything that's happened in 2024. It's going to take a while to compile the 2024 numbers. These are just annual looks here. But clearly, economies are militarizing due to a belligerent Russia and some of its allies. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching.